In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, one God. I don't have to tell you that in the last year or so, we've become more aware of how easy it is to get into conflict. Not just among nations, not just among political parties, but it seems that conflict is the fashion of the day. And if you hear people who want to give solutions to it, one of the answers is, well, why don't we get back to that place where we would just all give and take a little? Now, I don't want to focus on conflict or conflict resolution today, but that idea of giving and taking, I want to focus on that. Because in many ways, our lives could be seen and organized into our giving and our taking. So much of what we do, we see as giving, and so little of what we see is taking. You know, when we give, we're typically, or at least we think, we're pretty clear about it. We tend to remember it. We gave somebody a gift, we made a donation, we gave someone our time. And if we don't think that we're sensitive to it, just think about the last time that wasn't acknowledged, or maybe misunderstood, or even turned against you somehow. Then we realize how sensitive we are, how oversensitive we are to what we would call our giving. Think about it in our relationships, maybe in the families and marriages or at work. We tend to be very clear, at least in our minds, that we're giving, we've done this, we've given this. Doesn't even have to be tangible. It could be just an effort. And then there's the taking side. If we think about what we take in our relationships or from others, we tend to really underestimate that. Hard for us to look at ourselves as takers. And so if you think about it, in our view of the world, I'm not saying how realistic it is, this world is filled with a bunch of givers, and people really take very little. Well, we know that's not the vision of the world that we've come to see. And that's an indication for us that our perception of our give and take can be way off. That's what today's gospel is all about. It's a cautionary tale for us about somebody who really misunderstood his giving and his taking. Now, we know how the story ends, and so when we know the end of the story, we've heard this many times, we start to throw that knowledge back. And we say, wow, this guy, he's so selfish. But the story is told from a beginning to the end, and if we just forget the ending for a moment, it begs a question. What did this guy do that was so wrong? He was a farmer, and apparently he was a good farmer. So much the fact that all of what he took into the harvest, he didn't have enough place to store that which his farm had produced. It's not a bad thing to do, to be a good farmer, right? Then he does another thing. He says, well, I know what I'll do. I've got a problem here. I'll solve the problem. I'll build bigger barns. So he builds barns or silos or whatever he's storing his grain in. And he says, now I've done it. Now I've got enough. I can take my ease. I'll eat, drink, and be merry. If we stop there, we'd say, is that really so wrong? And the other question is it really so different from us? Don't we who are working go to work, we try to produce well? We want to produce for our families and for other things that we want to support. And so, is it really so wrong? And yet, we know how the story ends, that in the story that Jesus tells, God appears. There aren't many stories that Jesus tells where God appears. Often it's a parable and there's different characters. In this story, God himself becomes a character in the story. And what does God say to the man? He says, "You fool. You fool." And this is where we really have to think carefully about this gospel. Because it's very easy to say, well, that's him, and I'm nothing like that. And yet, Gospels are always written to all of us. If you think this gospel is not written for you, you misunderstood it. It is written to all of us because all of us need to hear the message. So what did he do that was so wrong? What makes him a fool? Well, we know a little bit from what the gospel itself tells us. It says that the things that he prepared are what he was storing up. He thought he had produced them. And in some ways, it's true. The man was a farmer and he grew grain. But the most obvious fact that should have been top of his head, he forgot. Just that he grew grain. Well, it should be obvious, but it wasn't obvious to him. Maybe it's not obvious to us. Farmers don't grow grain. God makes grain. Farmers interact, they assist, they plant, they fertilize, they water, they do all kinds of things, but a farmer, no matter how good he is, can't make a sprout of grain grow, not one. And that's the crucial mistake that the man of the gospel makes. It's the crucial mistake we all make. Maybe we make it a lot, maybe we make it not so often. We all make it to some degree or another. And that is to think that the things that we are given were produced by us. The gospel goes on, and Jesus gives the warning to all of us. He says, "So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." Now, he doesn't define that for us. We have to dig around a little bit to find what does that mean to be rich toward God. Well, one thing we know is that this man, if you asked him what he did day in and day out, he would tell you he was not taking, he was giving. Giving his time, giving his expertise, giving his energy and an effort to go out and grow that grain. And yet when Jesus says that this man was not rich toward God, we have to ask ourselves, why would he be rich toward God? And the answer is because God had been rich toward him. Everything that man did, although he gave some effort into it, was part of his receiving from God. Even when he went out to work and cut the grain and store the grain, and all that he did to supposedly produce was all part of his receiving from God. Yeah, he did some work in receiving it. If somebody gives you a gift, it's not effortless. You have to put out your hands and take it. You have to unwrap it. There's effort involved. But we know very clearly when we receive gifts how much of that is giving of our part and how much is receiving. And if we think about all the blessings God has given us, we realize that almost everything we do in life is not giving. It is almost all taking and receiving. St. Cyril of Alexandria says this very beautifully. His icon, by the way, is, some of you can see it, he's on the right there, two over from the middle on this side of the church behind the altar. He says the following, explaining this to us. He says, "What does the rich man do? Surrounded by a great supply of many blessings beyond all number. In distress and anxiety, he speaks the words of poverty. He says, 'What should I do?' He does not look to the future. He does not raise his eyes to God. He does not count it worth his while to gain for the mind those treasures that are above in heaven. He does not cherish love for the poor or desire in the esteem it gains. He does not sympathize with suffering. It gives him no pain nor awakens his pity. Still more irrational, he settles for himself the length of his life, as if he would also reap this from the ground." St. Cyril shows us the length of our irrational ideas. That when this man says, "I will have my store for many years," he thinks like he reaped grain out of the ground. He can number the number of years he has left. And you and I, if we don't know it, we should know very clearly, we do not number our days. We don't know, is this our last? We don't know. What we do know is that every day, every moment, No matter what day and what's happening, no matter how easy or how hard, we are always receiving because God is always blessing. It's easy to forget that when we think about getting through life by this give and take. We give and take with spouses and children and parents and partners and customers. We give and take and we give and take. And we get so used to giving and taking that we think most of the giving is us and most of the taking are others. And to that, God replied to the man of the gospel, "You fool." We are foolish when we think that that's what life really is. So the question is, how do we become rich toward God, who is always rich to us? In this last year, actually the last couple years, our stewardship ministry team has been trying to re-educate us on the idea of stewardship. And let's all confess that when we hear stewardship equals what I'm going to give to the church. That's not stewardship. Look it up. Go home and Google it or look in your dictionary. Stewardship is what it means to be a steward and how you enact being a steward. And a steward does not deal with his own goods. A steward is a steward. They take what is others, they do what is theirs to do with it, and then they give it all back to the master or the owner because it is not theirs. If you've been thinking about stewardship as what you're going to give to the church, I'm going to add to all the wonderful messages we've been hearing and say it's not about that. Get it out of your head that it's what you're going to give to the church. Why? Because you're going to write that check or you're going to go on Venmo and you're going to think you gave. Remember how good we are remembering what we give. And yet, remember what it means to be a steward, that we don't give anything. We receive, and when we're seeing clearly, everything we have is what we receive, and then we do a little bit with what we have, and we give it back to the one to whom it belongs. In just a few moments, when the liturgy continues, at one of the high points of the whole liturgy, the deacon will raise up the chalice and the discos. What is on them and in them? Our offerings. Bread. Wine. Where do bread and wine come from? That comes from man's processing of what God gives. God gives wheat. God gives salt and yeast and water. God gives grapes. And we receive those, and then we take a small portion, we process around as we'll do in a few minutes, and then we hold them up to God, and what do we say? Thine own of thine own. We hold up the highest level of our offering. We say, this is what is yours from what is yours. We don't say, look what we did, God. And yet how often in what we call our stewardship, we go, here's what I'm going to give. My brothers and sisters, what we give to the church is the smallest part of what really is stewardship. Stewardship is an attitude, it's a perspective. It's a view of your life in the world and of God that says, I'm not a giver. Once in a while I give back, but mostly I'm a taker because God's always giving. And He gives and He gives and He gives and He gives. That's what a steward does. A steward receives, he does something with it. A steward isn't lazy, not a good steward. But he realizes nothing is his alone, and he merely processes and gives back to the owner what is the owner's. So it's time for us to really rethink what stewardship is. Don't jump to the end. Don't say, oh, stewardship, I got to write my check. Go to the beginning and say, what does it mean? What does it mean for me to be invited to be a steward of the Most High? Imagine of all the households we've been invited to be stewards in. Could have been a little hut in the jungle somewhere. Could be a small little apartment somewhere. Could be a mansion somewhere. Or it could be the palace of the king. And that's where you and I have been invited to be stewards. So many people are saying there's so little to give thanks for this Thanksgiving. And how wrong we are if we think that. Name 1 second, 1 millisecond, that God has stopped showering us with his many blessings. And for every single difficulty mixed up in all those blessings, he also gives the solution to everything, including, as we keep saying, and we need to keep remembering, even death itself, he's already solved. We have no need of solution for anything. God's already given it. Much better than we know how to produce what there is to produce. He gives us everything. So it's time to redefine what we see as the give and take of our lives. Let's take this idea of giving and taking and get rid of it. Give it away. And let's take a right understanding of who God is and what he's doing. And if he invites us in some small way to participate in his work by being stewards, by our stewardship, let's be thankful even for that. The man in the story is one God called a fool. God didn't make us so that he can turn around and recognize in us foolishness. We were not made for foolishness. We were made to be sons and daughters in that house in which he invites us to serve even as stewards. He made us so that he could continually shower us with his blessings. That's why. Not so we can give us a little and see what we're going to do. He gives us everything to see what we can do with him. And then he wants us to share those blessings with those, as St. Cyril says, are the ones for whom we've received the blessings. St. Basil the Great says that extra coat in your closet that's rotting away, we've robbed from the man to whom it was supposed to be given. That's stewardship. To understand that everything we have comes from God. So let's recognize that. And we recognize God's blessings. We have only one response. We give thanks. Not just on Thanksgiving Day because there's football and turkey and all the rest. Because we realize every day, at every moment of those days, God is pouring out his goodness upon us. If we do that, then we can transform what was the give and take of our foolish lives into real gratitude. And we can become the chosen stewards of the good God who invites us into his goodness. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.